think a lot of people really overcomplicate photography, and this is something that just doesn't have to be the case. So today I'm going to share with you different ways I make sure I keep my photography simple and effortless. So firstly, knowing your camera is essential to keeping photography simple. You don't want to be fiddling with settings, working out how to use it, and all of these things when you're out taking photos. So spending a bit of time to just learn your camera, where different settings are, what different buttons do, and the kinds of setups that work for you is the best way to make sure that taking photos feels effortless. The more intuitively you can operate your camera, the less you need to go through the menu system and find different settings, the better you're going to get at photography, because you're not going to be spending time looking at your camera. You're going to be using your camera and photographing the world. And I understand that cameras can be quite overwhelming, but to be honest, when you spend a little bit of time going through them and getting a better understanding of photography, you'll start to realize that a lot of the settings really don't matter, and there's only a handful that do. I'll touch on a few of these essential settings later in this video, but just know that if you spend a little bit of time getting to know your camera, using it should feel intuitive, and it's going to make photography a whole lot easier. So next, I try to limit the amount of lenses I'm using. By limiting the amount of lenses I'm using, I'm really taking away a lot of decision-making problems that I might have when I need to decide which lens to bring with me. Limiting the amount of lenses you have will not only just make your bag a whole lot lighter, it will force you to become a lot more creative. Personally, I use standard focal lengths for the majority of my photos, and I have a 23mm, I have a 35mm, and also like an 18 to 55, and this is the range I work in. If I owned a super wide and a super tight, I would always be wondering which lens to bring with me. But by having just a handful of lenses, I don't really have to go through this whole process. And sure, I do think it's worthwhile trying out these lenses when you get the chance, but just rent, just borrow, just try find a way without buying them to test them out, because they might not even be your style. Next, I try to focus on composition basics. I don't try get super creative and try change the wheel when it comes to photography. I know that there's a bunch of photography composition techniques that make my photos more powerful and more pleasing to look at. So it's not my job to go out and change this approach. All I do is I try memorize them and get as creative as possible within them. And if you are wondering what a few of these are and a few of the ones that I use, I always look for leading lines in my photos. I always try frame with the rule of thirds. I often fill the frame if I can. And a lot of the time, I like to use negative space in my images as a way to draw attention to my subject. Understanding and getting an idea of composition basics has really informed my style. And that means when I go out and take photos, I'm not really worried about the types of photos I'm going to take, because I know that if I just look back to these techniques, that I can frame up different settings that I see. I know that this approach to shooting works, so I just kind of roll with that, and it means that when I go out and take photos, things don't feel complicated. They feel quite effortless because I can just snap away at what I know will look good. This next step that I take is something that I recommend to all beginner shooters, and even if you're a more experienced photographer, I would recommend trying it out. But personally, I use auto modes a lot on my camera, especially aperture priority. Shooting in aperture priority lets me control just the aperture of my camera. If you're not sure, different modes control different parts of your camera. Like manual mode means you need to control everything. Shutter priority means you get to control the shutter speed. So personally, I like to shoot with aperture priority because that means I can control the aperture and the depth in my images. I think depth is the biggest tool when it comes to my photography, because I like to make sure that I can either highlight a subject or make sure a whole scene is in focus. I rarely do slow shutter images, so shutter priority really isn't a thing for me, but I often take street portraits and landscape photos all on the same day. So being able to change the aperture and not worry about my ISO and my shutter speed is really powerful. Obviously, there's a time and place for manual shooting, especially in a professional setting, or where you know that you need to do things that your camera might not be able to comprehend at the time. But when it comes to travel and street photography, the photography you see here on my channel and on Instagram, aperture priority is incredible, and it just means I'm not fiddling with my settings or my camera at all. And by doing this, photography is a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable because I don't need to really worry about it. Some of the essential settings that I'd mentioned earlier that I would recommend you making really accessible on your camera. A lot of cameras have function button settings which open up a selection of your top favorite settings, but some of mine are my white balance, my film simulation, my ISO, my drive mode, and a bunch of other ones. These are all essential settings that I find are important that I need to have easy access to. As you probably know, after you've taken your photos, you're going to want to go and edit them. And I try to take this same approach and mindset to my editing workflow as well. I try to keep my editing workflow as streamlined as possible and to try to remove any kind of friction I might have. If I'm taking photos on my Fujifilm and I know I want to edit the RAWs, I'll just take the SD card out, put it in my laptop, and then import these images into Lightroom Classic. Personally, I find Lightroom Classic great for handling big batches of images, something that will happen after I've taken a long photo walk or I've done a big trip with a full SD card. If on the other hand, I want to edit JPEG photos from my Fujifilm, I'll just use the Fujifilm app, which is really great, and transfer my photos straight to my iPhone and then use Lightroom Mobile. Lightroom Mobile captures these photos and imports them straight into the gallery, and I can just edit from there. Keeping this workflow really simple is essential to me and my editing style. I like to edit a lot of my photos, and I would definitely recommend editing as a way to improve your images, and you don't really want editing to be a big, cumbersome problem to go through. So having it as simple and as easy to use as possible is a great way to keep photography effortless. This next approach I take to keeping photography effortless might be implied, but personally, I like to take a minimalist approach. Now, you might be wondering, what does that even mean? But a minimalist approach, in my opinion, when it comes to photography, is having a select amount of equipment and a small camera setup overall. If we start with having a select amount of equipment, this relates back to what we spoke about lenses, but by limiting the amount of gear you have, photography doesn't become this big, overwhelming, bearing thing that you do. Even me, I shoot as a professional, and I still like to keep my photography equipment stacked quite low. It means I can be nimble on professional shoots and also just upgrade a little easier. And on the other hand, when it comes to a small camera setup, I shoot with Sony mirrorless and Fujifilm mirrorless cameras. Both of these cameras are small and light, perfect for travel, perfect for my style of photography, and perfect for just carrying around. If I owned big Canon DSLRs or big fat Sony lenses, it wouldn't be as intuitive to use, as related to the style of photography I want, and overall it will make photography feel like this big heavy thing I need to do. It doesn't really fit me and my style. So if you are trying to make photography in general a whole lot easier on yourself, have a look at the gear that you're shooting with and try and minimize it as much as you can. Obviously, if you're a professional, you're going to need a lot more than someone who's just a hobbyist, but just having this mindset of not overbuying gear and always looking to new gear is a really great approach to have, because it's going to make your photography feel quite easy and adaptable. And lastly, this is a little bit more related to photography online and Instagram photography and sharing your work. But photography can feel overwhelming and difficult when you are following and consuming a bunch of content from professionals and people who live lavish lifestyles. Comparing your work to them can make photography feel like this unattainable thing. But to be honest, we just don't know where these people are in their career or their lifetime of shooting. They could have been shooting for 10 years and have lived in the most beautiful locations and had access to locations and people forever. There's no point in comparing your work to them, and there's no point in constantly comparing yourself, because it's going to make photography feel like this really annoying thing. Trust me, I've had a lot of photographer friends talk to me about why they're unhappy with their work and why they wish their work was X, Y, or Z. And I have to remind them that every artist's journey is different, and yours is going to be more different to mine, and you're going to have access to places that I can't see, and vice versa. So in a way to keep photography easy and effortless, just be careful about what you're consuming and how you kind of react when you are consuming this type of work. I hope if you look at my work, you're inspired and you like the look of how I handle colors and composition, but the last thing I want is for you to be jealous about places I visit. So maybe just start to do a little cull of who you're following and who you're consuming from to make sure that they aren't turning photography into this unattainable, difficult thing. And guys, that's essentially how I try to keep photography effortless and simple. I think when you keep photography effortless, it really shines through in your photos. By having a small camera setup, by understanding how your camera works, by limiting the amount of gear and lenses choices you have, you're going to grow a whole lot more as a photographer, and it's going to be a much more enjoyable experience. But guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope this came at a perfect time for you and your photography journey. If you have any questions, just leave them below, send me a DM. Otherwise, I'll see you soon.